Doctors Luke Moffat, Catherine Easton, and Joe Deville from the TAS security node at Lancaster University. Luke is a research associate in the Department of Sociology. Catherine is a reader in information technology and intellectual property law. And Joe is a senior lecturer from the Department of Sociology. Thank you so much for offering to give the talk today, and we look forward to hearing more about what's happening at TAS-S.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. Yeah, it's been really interesting to hear some of your thoughts on the kind of work that we're doing. So yes, I'm talking today about TAS, the Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Security Node, and also introducing some of the work that we're doing with National Highways, which is a partner organisation that we are collaborating with. As the title suggests there, we'll also be talking about some of the ways in which we're collaborating with them through so-called creative methods. But first, I thought I'd just give a brief overview of the structure of TAS. Here are three strands, not pillars, but strands. And the first of those, RS1 and RS2, are being led by computer scientists, and are focusing on issues of usage and operations. And then in the third strand, in which we are all based, we're aiming to feed into the bottom of those categories, into questions of preventative design. So what we're trying to do is, through our work, inform the work that's being done within the other research strands. More specifically, our work is then divided into three areas: issues of behavioural adaptation, organisational adaptation, and ethics, law and governance. Lisa Dawn at Cranfield is leading the work on behaviour adaptation, so that's coming from a more psychological perspective, and so that's not really part of this presentation today. What we're talking about more are the second and third of those, questions of organisational adaptation and ethics, law and governance. And nominally, I'm sort of leading some of the work on organisational adaptation, so that's thinking about how organisations might need to respond to the challenges of designing and deploying secure autonomous systems. And Catherine is leading on questions of ethics, law and governance. So I'm going to hand over to Luke now, who's going to talk a bit about some of the approaches and methods that we are using in our work. And then I'll come on to talk about how we're applying those in relation to our work with National Highways. So Luke, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so if you go on to the next slide, and in these next slides, I'm just going to talk fairly kind of high level on some of the conceptual and theoretical things that inform how we approach doing our work specifically with National Highways. So the first thing, which may seem obvious, is that the more autonomous systems that are designed and created and deployed, the more kinds of complexities and uncertainties that arise that are associated with them. And so the challenges around making those systems secure become more difficult and more complicated. And one of the approaches that we use in sociology is to try to rather than break down and segment these uncertainties and complexities, try to tackle them in their kind of actuality, see and visualize their scale. So one framework that we use for this is called the ELSI framework. So that's ethical, legal and social issues, which is one of many different interdisciplinary frameworks that are used across UK and Europe to do most of the time with new technologies. And the idea here is that rather than seeing an ethical or a legal or a technical or a social issue as being separate, it's a way to see them all as interconnected and interdependent. So this is one kind of large scale framework that we're using specifically in relation to autonomous systems security. And one of the things that it tries to bring out is that any given, even a singular technology, is not just an isolated thing. It's this massive network of material components, political ideologies, perceptions, social and cultural norms, sometimes polemics. So all of these things are important and are kind of entangled with each other. And one large part of what we're interested in is to see not just how technologies come to be made and designed, but how they are received and perceived by publics. And one obvious kind of way to get into that is by looking at controversy. So this is one area that Joe's particularly skilled in, looking at how, because of the rapid development of autonomous systems, you can kind of track the controversies around public perceptions of them as they emerge and as they progress, almost in real time. So that's one interest of ours. And also, you know, the one rationale behind this is that if something like secure autonomous systems is going to be a possibility, we need to draw on every resource and every discipline that we can to ensure that that happens because of these kind of growing complexities. Okay, next slide.
I think
so this is actually Catherine's area of expertise, so I'll hand over to her briefly to talk about this.
Thanks, Luke. So obviously we're working in relation to a security node here, but the challenges and the issues of actually embedding an emphasis on law, legal development, regulation are pretty much apply in this area as they do in many others. So again, at the beginning, as we were just talking, it was mentioned that we speak different languages and we need that opportunity and that focus on collaboration and an iterative process in which we develop change. So what is so exciting about this project is the use of the methodologies that Luke and Joe can actually support and bring to the project to enable an ongoing conversation between the developers of these technologies to look at, yes, the societal, ethical issues, but then also the legal issues as well. So obviously the legal issues are sometimes quite difficult because they are so specific. And what you often get is a very kind of knee-jerk tick box response to the legal framework that actually, let's say, constrains or is deemed to constrain the project's development. What we want to do is try to break this down using the innovative methods that we're employing in order to say, okay, where's this conversation? You can feed into the policy development, the regulatory development, and not just see law as an end result of a long process, something you need to think about at the beginning, but then you can come back to, you can make changes, and it's an evolutionary interaction throughout a project. Now, that does sound pretty ambitious, but obviously we're looking at this with the work with National Highways for specific projects and activities, and then building upon the responses in order to take what we've learned further and then embed this in the further work we do on autonomous systems and security. So, yeah, great. Next slide, please.
Trying to unmute myself. Yeah, so all of this feeds into, you know, this general point that whether it's an issue of law and regulation, of technical possibility, of some form of governance, all of these things interconnect with each other and inform each other in what we call socio-technicity. So the idea that technology and society are not isolated from one another. Technologies are also social beings like us. So, you know, the idea of examining what the social life of an autonomous system is very interesting to us. And, you know, as I kind of mentioned already, the possibility of a particular system, whether it's a drone or a driverless car or AI, is entangled with the cultural imaginaries around that kind of system, the political schemas and prerogatives of whoever happens to be in power, and ethical values around what it is that's deemed important by a society, by communities. So the point here is that with an issue like security, or indeed any of the issues that TAS is examining, the technical readiness of a system is not sufficient unless you also have some kind of societal readiness. So this is the idea that rather than society being ready for a technology, we need to ask whether a technology is ready for society. And this feeds into some of the work that we're doing, particularly on ethical questions of autonomous systems. And this in turn kind of informs a hopefully broader understanding of security, where it's not simply a technical understanding of vulnerability to attack or something like that, but that's also combined with wider kind of notions of public security, of financial security, of environmental security even. So we're trying to kind of, in these methods, broaden some of the things which tend to get very narrowed down and specific to try to understand them in different ways, and also communicate them to publics who are going to end up using or being used by these systems. Next slide, please. So one of my interests in particular, and how I'm designing these methods that we'll talk about with National Highways, is how ethics works in relation to autonomous systems. And one of the things in a lot of the literature around ethics of technology, and particularly ethics of AS, is that ethical values are often talked about in very abstract ways. So, you know, philosophical ethics, as an example, tends to be very removed from concrete situations and deals with things in kind of hypothetical scenarios, which may be useful in an intellectual sense, but they can sometimes be a little bit too detached from a lived reality. So something like this front cover of an introduction to ethics book kind of points out the problem that if you think of ethics just as a series of rules or a series of capacities that are in your brain or in your mind, it's very hard to make a real connection between those and actual lived experience, which is much messier, much more complicated, etc. And a lot of kind of westernized ethical theories that you find being used in ethics of technology literature take values as these kind of immaterial abstract rules. So the consequence is that being ethical in relation to technologies just means following rules, right? And this is one of the notions of ethics that our research is trying to problematize. So if you go to the next slide, Joe, if you draw out some of the consequences of this theoretical ethics perspective, what you end up having is when technologies are actually being developed, and a research project like this does consultancy with industrial partners and things like that, the ethics dimension of the project tends to become this tick box exercise where you say, okay, we've done X, Y, and Z, so our project is ethical, so the technology is ethical, end of story. And so you get this kind of isolated ethics office that's responsible for, you know, checking that everyone's doing what they should be doing. And then you get this kind of larger syndrome, the not my domain syndrome, where you try to discuss ethical issues with people who are quite rightly focused on making the technology work. And however sympathetic they might be to those ethical issues, the response can be, that's all interesting, but that's not my domain. It's not my responsibility to be concerned with that. You humanities people go and do the ethics stuff. We're just trying to make the thing work, right? So this is a result of this kind of conception of ethics as being this abstract set of rules. And the problem with rules is that they can be bent, they can be spun, they can be worked around. They're not rigid guides for conduct. They're just abstract ideals that can be worked around. So the idea, getting a little bit kind of philosophical and stuff, the idea is that ethics in a lot of the literature around autonomous systems, when those two things come together, is discussed with the logic of a value chain, meaning that if an ethical value, let's say trust, is put into a system or into a project from the beginning, then it just travels along every element in that chain until you get to the final product, and trust has been preserved all the way through. And if you go to the next slide, Joe, the idea that we're trying to use in our methods with National Highways as well as the wider research is that actually what is more appropriate when talking about highly complex things like autonomous systems is to move from a value chain where you try and preserve a value all the way along to a value constellation in which a value like trust doesn't just remain unaltered and abstract all the way along a project's run, but actually changes depending on what it encounters. So the meaning of trust when you talk to a computer scientist is not the same as the meaning of trust when you talk to a legal scholar or a sociologist or a philosopher, etc. And all of those meanings of trust are both entangled and equally important when trying to understand something like an autonomous system. So the idea is that the methods that we use emphasize the codependence and entanglement of different elements of a system and different disciplinary perspectives, such that ethical issues are not immune or separate from issues of security, and those issues of security are not immune from technical possibility, etc. They're all connected in a significant way, and so they all need to be tackled in a significant way. And the hope is that by looking at ethics from this perspective in relation to autonomous systems security, we can start to make a move from just ethics in theory to actual ethical conduct, in which autonomous systems design is not just monitored by the ethics office, but actually ethics becomes a part of the design process. So we kind of move away from this security by design or ethics by design to ethics through design. Which leads to the next slide, please, Joe. So this is where it starts to get hopefully a little bit more concrete. Ethics and security through design is one of the frameworks that was developed primarily through the Is It Ethical consortium that I'll link to in the chat a bit later. And the idea behind this is that it's a methodology which, first of all, is inherently interdisciplinary, and through creative and arts-based methods, opens spaces in collaborative projects where you can exchange knowledge, but also foster circumspect and critical reflection on these ethical, legal and social issues in relation to autonomous technology and how it's deployed in the world. So one of the advantages of using these creative methods that we'll go into a bit more detail about is that when you try to open conversations, particularly on ethical issues of technology, they can seem very daunting or very, as I said, abstract. And creative methods are a way of opening a space that's perhaps a little bit more accessible to start with, or a little bit more encouraging, where people don't feel so daunted to bring up quite difficult issues. And then once that space is opened, it becomes much more viable for these very important and sometimes quite difficult challenges to be voiced and shared. So the emphasis is very much on the process, it's through, not by. And in the security node, we're extending this to deal not just with, as I said, ethics, but also how you could understand something like security through design rather than simply by design. So that's a kind of a large level look at one of the methods that we're using. And I think now Joe is going to discuss how this translates into our work with National Highways. So I'll pass back.
Brilliant. Thanks, Luke. So yeah, I'm going to talk about this collaboration that we're sort of in the middle of at the moment with National Highways. For those of you that don't know what National Highways is, you've probably seen their signs, although probably they still have the Highways England branding on them, because they were previously called Highways England, have only just recently changed their name to National Highways. Although, as it sort of says here, they're actually responsible nonetheless for England's motorways and roads. So yeah, National Highways is a government company, and then the government delegates to them the work of operating, maintaining and improving England's motorways and major A roads. As an organisation, I think it's a particularly interesting organisation to work with for us, because it's an organisation that is quite heavily invested in thinking through questions of the future. They've already undertaken, prior to our work with them, for example, scenario planning activities, thinking about how changes in technology might impact their work in, say, 5, 10, 15 years and so on. And they're quite open to working with social scientists of different perspectives in helping them think through some of those issues. So it was a very nice conversation to begin, to open with them, and it's one they've so far been very, very receptive to the work that we've been doing with them. In terms of security specifically, I think for National Highways, the collaboration with us already has made them think a lot more about questions of security than they perhaps were previously. I think it's a concern for them in relation to the technologies that they're developing and deploying. Security, for example, might be thought around questions of attack from a malicious actor. So what would happen, for example, if a malicious actor was to hack into the traffic management systems that are deployed on England's motorways? So that's the kind of way in which they were thinking about security probably already. What we are doing with them and hoping to do more with them is get them to broaden out those understandings of security in some of the ways that Luke was just talking about. So This collaboration is the first of hopefully 3 collaborations that we'll be involved in over the course of the TAS-S project. That's what we said that we would do. Collaborations are between 9 and 12 months. We anticipate that some of the collaborations may not be quite as in-depth as our collaboration with National Highways, but the aim of that I'll come on to in a second, but we also have a specific aim for National Highways, and that is for us to deliver what we call actionable insights for them. What we don't want to do is just come in as researchers and suck up the data and go off and write a bunch of papers. The aim of the collaboration is this is a genuine collaboration where there's benefits for everyone involved. I'll come on to what those might be in a second, but then of course for us, it's a really valuable collaboration for us. What we're trying to do is, alongside writing academic papers and so on, is to develop ways for organizations to think through these issues, intersecting issues of ethics and security in different ways, in that attempt that Luke was talking about to move more towards forms of organizational or supporting forms of ethical organizational conduct. So one of the things that we want to achieve by the end of the project is to develop sets of resources that can hopefully enable them to think through these questions of ethics and security in different ways, without potentially having to work with academic researchers, although of course, it's something that we would certainly encourage. So this is what we've agreed to deliver to National Highways, a presentation of some existing research around the kinds of technologies that they're thinking about. Workshops, both, well, initially it was proposed to be in person and online. Those have all shifted to online. And then analysis of these workshops we'll present back to them. But then importantly, this final transitions report. So what we want to do is present to them a kind of roadmap for moving towards a different way of engaging with autonomous systems. This will be centered around this co-created values framework, which they can then use when they're thinking about questions of the design of autonomous systems and the deployment of autonomous systems, hopefully in ways that address questions of security in a broader way, but that are also technically more secure. As part of that, we'll also be thinking about scenarios. We are using in some of our work with them, we're using methods that are informed by scenarios-based thinking, specifically an approach called backcasting, that will think about how National Highways, what National Highways can do in the present to achieve some desired end goals as an organization. Specifically, in our work with them, our work is sort of centered around 2 broad themes. So one is around organizational adaptation, which is something I mentioned previously in our kind of overview of the research strand. So there it's thinking about what kind of roles National Highways as an organization will play in future road networks, potentially in England, but also more broadly. They're thinking about developing a centre of excellence. What questions should that centre of excellence ask? How should they engage with regulators? We've already had discussions with them and also with the regulators who are currently trying to develop the legal frameworks which will inform, for example, the design and deployment of autonomous vehicles on UK roads. How should they engage with them? What kind of questions should they be asking? What kind of responsibilities and forms of accountability, to link back to some of the work that you're doing, should they be taking ownership of? What guidelines should they perhaps be using for autonomous systems use and design? But then there's also a kind of outward-facing theme, which is around public engagement. How to engage the diverse publics that inevitably, whether an organisation wants them to or not, will cluster around the deployment of a new technology. How can they anticipate controversies that might emerge? How also should they manage crossing sectors and domains? One of the things about autonomous systems is they tend to extend the networks of responsibility. How should they manage some of these complexities? How might they embed more participatory methods in the design processes that they use? And what forms of public input counts? And who gets to decide on those questions of what kind of public perspective should be taken into account when thinking about an organizational, thinking about forms of organizational conduct? So far we've conducted 2 workshops with them, and what I'm going to do now is just present some initial, I guess, insights from those workshops. They're very, very top level. We've certainly got a lot more work to do with them. So we are doing this via a research around 3 different case studies. So the first of those is connected and autonomous vehicles. So obviously for national highways, this presents a major challenge. The prospect of increasing numbers of autonomous vehicles on England's roads and on UK roads presents a real challenge to them, and thinking through what their responsibilities might be. How, in those contexts, should they be feeding into debates about how to build secure systems in the face of uncertain regulations around connected and autonomous vehicles? What are public perceptions around connected and autonomous vehicle security, and what role might cultural norms and expectations play in secure, connected and autonomous vehicles design? And then in our work with our, as a team, but also in our work with them, we're then in each of these case studies thinking about how we can input into these questions more theoretically, and how we can then begin to translate some of the theories that we're working with in our own work into our conversations with them. So thinking about questions of more than human agency. How do we think about the fact that these technologies very much have an agency of their own? How do we want to think about what that means for an organization? How might we want to think about the role of infrastructures? Obviously, national highways are deeply concerned with questions of infrastructure, tending to see infrastructures as things, but we would argue, many of us have a background in science and technology studies, that infrastructures are inevitably social. How does thinking about infrastructures as social change the perspective for national highways and what they're doing? And then also thinking about questions of ethics through design, as Luke was talking about. Second case study is around autonomous plant. So this means the machines that could potentially build and maintain the UK's road network. So this isn't something that currently is in active deployment, but it is a technology that national highways are thinking about. There are potentials to deploy autonomous plant technologies at some point in the future, whether that be in 5, 10, 15 years. Again, that question of cultural norms around design is one that they're thinking with. But for them, they're also telling us that one of the real challenges is how could they achieve buy-in from the different people that work within national highways and that they contract? How might these technologies be seen? Will they potentially pose threats to employment and to people's jobs and so on? And then again, what might the potential public controversies be around these technologies? If you're driving down a motorway and at the side of the motorway is an autonomous technology getting on with the process of maintaining a road, how are people going to react to that? There are all kinds of ways in which we can expect there to be potential controversies around this. The theoretical input, some of the theoretical inputs that we'll be bringing to this, thinking about questions of distributed security, the fact that these technologies are inevitably networked and therefore provide all kinds of opportunities for other forms of malicious intervention. And we can think about studies of the social basis of systems failure, that if you want to introduce a system, you need to not just think about the technical kind of competency of system, but also the sort of social and cultural roots and contexts into which these systems are deployed, and then thinking also through methods like controversy analysis. We're kind of running out of time a little bit, so just a third case study here around the supply chain. Connected and autonomous vehicles, autonomous plant, autonomous or the kind of traffic regulation technologies that national highways are using inevitably mean increasingly stretched supply chains. These raise questions of security. How secure are these stretched supply chains? What role is there for automation in different parts of these supply chains? And how are questions of sustainability integrated into these increasingly stretched and globally distributed supply chains? I think I'll skip forward just in the interest of time, because Luke, I think you wanted to talk briefly about a specific creative method that we've been using in one of our workshops with them, and that's the "Is it ethical" card game.
Yeah, so I'll try and kind of go quickly over this, but just to give an idea of some of the actual, techniques and materials that we use. So this is a game of cards that was again developed through the Ethical Consortium, in which a deck of ethical value cards is distributed among players. And the aim of this game specifically is kind of follows a Texas Hold'em mechanic, where the objective is to end the game after going around all the players with a set of 3 values upon which everyone agrees. And these 3 values inform what we call an ELSI vision, in which they're taken as kind of these high-level values that can inform the future work that National Highways will do. And the idea is that you may have to negotiate between values that different people want. You may have values that appear on the table that aren't compatible with each other and sometimes straightforwardly contradict each other. So this is a technique to try and open a kind of critical discussion on, firstly, what these values mean to people. I mentioned trust already. It means different things to different people. And also how you go through this process of having to sometimes trade some values for others and not get absolutely everything that you want. So this generated a really fascinating discussion. There was actually quite an engaged discussion around whether, I think it was accountability, should replace another card that was Two-Spirit, which is actually a card inspired by indigenous protocols for AI. So it does open up this conversation where you get a grasp of how different people's perceptions and priorities are, and you have to go through this difficult work of negotiating whether you're going to get what you want or kind of concede to somebody else. So the cards that we actually ended up with were, well, trust kind of laid in an ambiguous position where it wasn't decided if it was going to replace another card or not in the end. And then we ended up with, I'm just going to see if I can get them up now. So we ended up with the 3 values being security, Two-Spirit that I mentioned, and sustainability. And it still wasn't a kind of closed case by the time we got to the end of the workshop. So as I said, the objective here is, rather than just going straightforwardly to people and saying, what do you think about trust? Do you think trust is more important than security, etc.? You have this mechanic that can kind of open it in a slightly softer way and still get to those difficult conversations, but through something that's maybe a little less intimidating than just straightforwardly asking someone to their face. So that's an example of one of the methods that we used in the most recent workshops.
Luke, we're kind of out of time, I guess.
Yeah.
I want to just hand over to Catherine just to talk briefly about issues of regulation, and then perhaps we can just open it out to questions rather than kind of going more over time.
Yeah.
So Catherine.
Great. I won't go too much over time, but hopefully you've been able to see how these innovative methods are enabling us to probe more deeply into such a, again, it's been put in the chat, it's such an important public part of the public infrastructure as well, and to try to work out how lawmakers actually understand the functioning of this infrastructure, particularly in relation to security and the use of these autonomous systems, and then to look towards the future. Okay, so is the legal framework actually giving us the future that we want in these very important networks as well? Does it give us the future we want? Do we understand what security is within these futures and within the legal and regulatory environment as well? So it's been sort of fascinating journey to try, say, at a small level in these projects to start to work on trying to sort of break down some of the sort of existing assumptions and develop these methodologies that enable us to have a much stronger interactive interplay with the notions of law, future and society there as well. Thanks.
Great. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Sorry, we went a bit over time, and yeah, welcome any questions at all.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting talk. There were a lot of issues that you discussed. I'm trying to still get my head around everything. There were a few questions that were raised in the chat. I don't know if you've had a chance to look. I know Luke and Catherine responded to some of those. So Stuart first asked, do you have an example of a security issue that only arises in autonomous systems?
I mean, I guess there's, one large scale issue is that when you delegate more capacity and perhaps even responsibility to an autonomous system rather than a human agent, then you get the question of who is accountable if a security issue arises. As autonomous systems get increasingly complex and can perform more and more tasks that were previously only humans were kind of able to do, then you get into this difficult territory where autonomous systems specifically are, in a sense, taking or are being given a certain portion of human agency to make decisions. And when a decision like that goes wrong or is intercepted, then the task becomes trying to trace back who ultimately or what is responsible for that mistake. So I think that's something specific to, especially when you have autonomous systems which are themselves performing security tasks, then you get this kind of difficult territory of who or what is responsible.
Does that answer your question, Stuart? Okay. Are there any other questions?
Maybe I can also, I think it's a really good question, and it's not one I've really thought about. So I don't think my answer is very good. Just to come back a little bit, in case we're waiting for any other questions, and I can see the discussion in the chat there. But my sort of instinct, and it might be a wrong instinct, is to be a little bit hesitant to sort of fetishize the uniqueness of autonomous systems as compared to other technologies in and of their own right, in the sense that they are more complex and they have perhaps a wider range of dependencies and sort of networks in which they become deeply enmeshed in these systems. But I guess in a way, I say my instinct is to kind of be a bit hesitant to just assume that there is a security that is entirely specific to an autonomous system, particularly if we're thinking about this broader notion of security. But then my computer science colleagues may entirely disagree with me.
I mean, I suppose I just wondered whether there was a kind of a relatively small, sharp example that you could say, well, the autonomy is really the thing that's giving us the security problem here in some sense. And because, I mean, I was struck at the beginning, a lot of what you were saying could have been said about safety systems. Yeah. And that, I mean, the element that you have with safety systems is that in some sense you kind of close up the world. That's what you can do. Whereas with security you can't, because you have to work in an open world, because you have to presume that there are unanticipated attacks on the system. But I just wondered if there was some kind of, and that's what I see as a characteristic thing about assurance for security, that you have to have this open-ended business. And then I just wondered how autonomy might push things in a different way. I mean, the other question I had, the one following that, I think occurred to me when Luke was talking, which was, we're not very good at designing the rules. I mean, years and years ago, I had a student looking at privacy, and it was about trying to produce some kind of thing that would advise you about how to set your privacy settings in Facebook, and then what we realized was that actually, in some sense, it depended on what everybody else did, and that actually the Facebook rules were not designed to permit an individual really to have control over their information if they wanted to have friends, because the whole friend to friend thing, actually blows an individual. So achieving individual privacy is impossible in that environment, and and inadvertently all kinds of terrible things happen. And I guess for me, the thing is, do you think we're good enough at designing the rules? I mean, even if everybody was perfectly following them, do you think we're good enough at designing those kind of things? And do you think that people are good enough in terms of understanding what the consequences are in what is a potentially massive, highly distributed environment? So it's so I guess the thing about that, there's Okay, so there's issues about rule violations and so on, and different interpretations of rules and so on. But even if everybody was perfectly interpreting them with the same interpretation, I think there are still potential problems in the way that we design rules, particularly when they come to talk about interaction. And Ajitha, you added a little bit of extra on the end of there, so I just wondered the extent to which you wondered about that.
I think we probably could all speak to that one, I should think, because it's something that we're really interested in. So my quick response would be, I think that's precisely why we're thinking more about conduct rather than rules. So it's about changing ways of working. And I think, this is an inevitably imperfect exercise, right? So, the idea of a set of rules or even changing conduct that's just going to magically solve all the problems of autonomous system security and ethics is, that's just highly unlikely. We're sort of fairly modest, I think, in what the possibilities are for our intervention. But yeah, I think that's the issue. I think with, as Luke was saying, the issue with sets of rules is that, they become performative, far too easily. They can become just a tick box exercise, where what's actually happening on the ground is often very much going against the spirit, perhaps, that was informing the design of those rules in the first place. And the second thing I just want to say as well quickly is just that then this issue of kind of, the behavior of other people affecting what you're doing, I think is one that's really, really important. And it's precisely for that reason that we would argue for a more distributed sense of security. That, just because you design a technology that's resistant to being hacked doesn't necessarily mean that it's a secure technology when it's deployed in the real world. And people have very different ways of starting to use it and interpreting it and resisting it and whatever it might be. So that's kind of why we'd argue for a broader notion of security.
I mean, I think everybody can be operating in a benevolent way, and still you get unintended consequences, actually. But
yeah, I mean, to give one brief example, this other project I worked on briefly recently was around using AI for language acquisition, and one of the things that came up almost immediately was if, as a European project, we were to follow GDPR to the letter, this project would be impossible. And GDPR is obviously written with the intent to, well, let's assume to bring about good or better outcomes for everyone involved. So that's a case where, following the rules not only may make things worse for your project, but isn't actually possible. It was to do with whether you're a data controller or a data processor, things like that. So it does happen. And, as computer scientists, the team we were working with said, when we see a set of rules, we see them as barriers to what we want to make. So the first thing we discuss is how do we get around them? So in both cases, whether you're trying to follow or get around the rules, you can very often end up with even an unintentionally worse result.
Thank you. I'm just going to let Robin ask his question. I'm just a bit aware of time.
Oh, great. I waited a long time so I could have the last question. Fantastic.
No, it's not the last question. We still have.
It's nice to see you guys.
I want to do one more.
And Stuart and I, about 10 years ago, were working with some people from Lancaster, some of whom you may know, social scientists and computer scientists, on dependability of computer-based systems, and came up with the idea of dependability as ordinary action, as a practical achievement of social material assemblages of some sort. And I kind of liked the nod you gave to infrastructures as practices, but I just wonder how you deal with the tension. Because in your criticism of these abstract treatments of ethics and values, and you bring them into a room and all you see is individuals and then these disembodied values, that also applies to some of the approaches that you're endowing, like perhaps your card game. And I'm a kind of empirical sociologist. So I'm much more, and Stuart and I are working together, so we don't know where the sociologist ends and the engineer and the lawyer start. So long have we been working together in the field. So that makes me much more confident about drawing inferences in contexts where we can examine practice and social materiality being worked out in practice. and these things cannot be determined by rule-based systems, which is why they're learnt in practice. And so we think learning by doing is a key feature. It's a key. It's one of the reasons why infrastructuring happens. Yes, that you cannot. Infrastructuring arises because the designers cannot anticipate all the requirements of users now and emerging users and users, and therefore the infrastructure has to be continually reworked by a multitude of players. And so there's a particular form of infrastructure becomes a particular form of social materiality, but it leaves me feeling I'm happier. I'm feeling I'm more confident if I can begin to address these things in those very concrete socio-material settings, and I'm more anxious when we try to divorce activities from those settings. But it struck me that you've criticised the abstraction of ethics, but then you're wanting to do this process of abstraction in other parts of your talk. So my question is I've just posted, aren't your ideas about value constellation, which I mean, we see stuff about privacy by design and ethical design, and we wrote a paper about why, we call this the design fallacy. It ignores the way that designs are themselves the products of earlier condensations of earlier innovations, and designs have to be radically reworked through what Jamie Fleck calls inner-fusion, and domesticated by adopters. So the privileging of design is, to our mind, dangerous and unhelpful, and misses out the real ways that social actors can shape social material assemblages. But I want to challenge you. You seem to want to. Your value constellation approach actually requires you to dismantle the idea of ethical design, but you still seem kind of quite centrally attached to it. So is there a contradiction there? That was a very long question.
Oh, that's a good question. So Luke and Catherine, feel free to chip in. So I'm guessing that part of what your kind of like, let's say, set anxiety might be about is about, for example, a card game where you end up abstracting these very disembodied sort of values from a particular setting. So in some sense that we're kind of reproducing the kind of abstract version of ethics that that we're criticizing. And I suppose, yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing to say. Aside from, I suppose, in a way, we're probably more interested in the game than the eventual cards that come out. So yeah, so the process of engaging our participants in that game, I think, is a really important part of what we're trying to do. And the aim is that becomes a domain of practice. It's a way. So one of the things that the National Highways colleagues said to us after these workshops, it's really good that we're actually having an opportunity to start to talk about these issues together, because we're all working on these individual problems. We actually rarely get a chance to talk and to step back a little bit from our work and think about what the broader context might be. So the part of what you're doing through that, through that kind of activity is fostering a different kind of form of conversation, and I suppose a different form of practice. Now I think it's reasonable to then say, how sustainable is that? Once we've left the building, the virtual building, or whatever it might be. But I suppose that yeah, I guess that would be part of my response anyway. That that is as much a kind of domain as practice as the kind of process of designing technology itself. But Catherine and Luke, did you want to say something?
I would say the abstraction in terms of the methods allows for the forging of links that might not have been there before, and a kind of a more self-reflective focus on process as well, in trying to work out, okay, exactly how do we respond within certain frameworks. And while obviously this might not be the actual realities of the design, I do think the abstracted approach does enable sort of stronger, more contextual links to be made back into the design process. And it's been really useful for me, coming from quite a kind of black letter legal background, to kind of understand some of these processes through these active methods as well, which obviously I'm not something I originally started out working in that field. And then it enables a more questioning mindset as well, rather than certain designers getting very focused on the kind of one particular aim they need to achieve from this part of their activity on this project. So yes, it is abstracted, but I think it's the way in which that's then built into our conclusions and the work, the kind of practices of the designers. We hope to fold that back into the realities of the text development.
Yeah, I would just add super quickly, because I know we're about to end, that there's always going to be a certain amount of abstraction involved, because ultimately we are researchers. That's kind of part of what we do. We're not National Highways, we're researching with them. But part of the idea of the value constellation is that rather than saying there are these abstract values and we know basically what they mean, it's really just saying that take privacy, for example. Privacy meant something very specific when it referred to private property, and it means something very different when it's in the context of data practices, and it means something even different from in the journey from kind of data privacy and retaining ownership of one's data to now the basic understanding that no data is really owned by anyone, even those who provide it. So every ethical value is changed by what it encounters. That's the basic idea. And I think, like Catherine was saying, the point is that not just that we come in and we do the kind of ethics bit of a project and then it's done and you say, okay, we have an ethics team, so now we're an ethical project. It's rather to leave these things that then, if they so choose, or if they have the capacity, organizations can come back to later and kind of consult and use as a way to negotiate their practice. That's the hope, anyway.
Can I ask a quick question, Ajita? Yeah,
really quick.
So this is really quick. So, I mean, when you were talking about the national highways, it struck me that of course the national highways is the commons, yeah, and I wondered whether you'd thought about management of commons as a kind of approach to these kinds of issues, because of course when you add CAVs into this, then you add additional information, and so there are more opportunities for cooperation, and there are even more opportunities for conflict. And the failure to align norms at all, I think gets bigger and bigger. So you look at reconciling climate against the logistics business, then they want to go faster. The climate guys want you to go slower. You can say who's been going faster, who's been going slower, who's been misbehaving in terms of the behavior of their vehicle. So it seems to me that actually, the kind of work on things like polycentric governance and so on seem to come in a big way here. And I just wondered whether you thought at all about that sort of thing.
I think we rate like a 2-word answer. Not really, but I think we should. It's because I know we don't have time. But I mean, obviously, it's interesting. It's an interesting question in the context of an organisation which is actually a company, to which the task of managing the roads is delegated. But so I think that question in the Commons is one that is something that, I think we should think about. And I really appreciate that intervention. It's an appropriate one coming from the governance note. So thank you.
Okay.
All right. We're unfortunately out of time. I wish I had time to ask questions as well. But thank you so much for joining us today.